They said she was too big, too broken, too much for any man to love. But in the mountains of Montana, where storms claw at the sky and secrets run deeper than any valley, the most dangerous love stories are the ones that write themselves in the snow. Montana Territory, 1887. Margaret Sullivan was about to learn that love doesn't just come in unexpected packages. Sometimes it comes to burn your whole world down. The cold bit her skin before the wind had the chance. When Margaret stepped off that stagecoach in Snowvale, she clutched a threadbare shawl around shoulders that were wider than most doorways. The single trunk at her feet looked impossibly small next to her, a tiny box for the lifetime of shame she carried inside. She stood tall, taller than the men on the platform, taller than their expectations, taller than the life they'd already decided for her. Her dress, once loose, strained at the seams. They didn't stare at first. They were polite like that. They'd let the whispers do the work. The driver didn't even offer a hand with her luggage. He just muttered something that sounded like good luck and snapped the reins, leaving her in a cloud of frozen dust and quiet contempt. Across the muddy street, a group of men outside the general store stopped talking. One nudged the other. Then came the first sound, a low chuckle, sharp as a shard of ice. "Mail order bride for a grizzly," one of them whispered, just loud enough to carry on the wind. She heard it. Of course, she heard it. Margaret Sullivan had built a fortress around her heart, brick by painful brick. But the words still found the cracks. Her cheeks flushed a deep crimson under her wool bonnet. She gripped the handles of her trunk, the leather groaning under the strain, and began the long walk toward the small church at the end of the street. The advertisement had said the introduction dinner would be held there, a civilized welcome. She walked with a purpose she didn't feel, her heart folding in on itself with every heavy step. Her boots crunched in the half-frozen mud, sinking just a little too deep, another reminder that she didn't belong. She could feel their stares on her back, tiny daggers of judgment. The church doors creaked open, and a wave of warmth washed over her. It smelled of roast venison, wood smoke, and something spiced like cinnamon. It was the kind of warmth she'd only ever dreamed of, growing up an orphan in a Boston boarding house where the only heat came from the steam of the laundry presses. She stepped inside and a dozen heads turned, and then a profound silence fell over the room. It was heavier than any insult. The quiet was quickly replaced by a ripple of laughter. Low at first, quickly smothered behind gloved hands and turned shoulders. Women blinked, their eyes lingering on her size. A man near the front scoffed and elbowed his friend. A teenage girl, her face a mask of cruel curiosity, whispered, "Is that her?" As if Margaret were a parade attraction and not a woman standing 3 feet away. She kept walking. She didn't blink, didn't pause, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Every step echoed on the wooden floorboards, a lonely drum beat in a hostile room. "Who brings a mountain into a church?" someone hissed from the back pews. The reverend, a thin man with a face like pinched dough, cleared his throat. But he didn't say a word to the crowd, and he certainly didn't say one to her. She reached the very last pew, her hands trembling so violently she had to hide them in her lap, and sat down, alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel sweat beating under her arms, despite the chill that had followed her inside. Still, she kept her chin held high, her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the altar. She would not break. Not here. Not again. Across the aisle, a little girl with curls like spun gold crawled onto her father's lap. She couldn't have been more than 5. She pointed a small, determined finger directly at Margaret. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent church. "She is so cute." Margaret froze, every muscle in her body locked into place. The whispers died instantly. Every eye in the room swiveled from her to the cowboy and his daughter. The cowboy turned his head, slow and deliberate, his hat pulled low over his brow. His face was weathered, carved by wind and sun, a landscape of unreadable lines that gave nothing away. His daughter tugged on his sleeve, pointing again, more insistently this time. "Look, Daddy, she's pretty." He looked at Margaret then. Really looked. Not at her size, not at her worn dress, but at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that godforsaken stagecoach, someone didn't laugh. He didn't smile. Not really. He just gave her a single solitary nod. It was a small gesture, but it felt like an anchor in a raging sea. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Her fingers gripped the hard edge of the pew as if she were hanging from a cliff. The little girl gave a tiny enthusiastic wave. The moment shattered. A woman near the front, the one who looked like she'd been sucking on a lemon her whole life, scoffed loud enough to reset the room's cruel rhythm. Well, children don't know any better, she muttered to her neighbor. Another woman chimed in. She won't be staying. Mark my words. The cowboy didn't speak. He just stood, settled his daughter on his hip, and started for the door. The whispers started up again, confident now that the strange moment had passed. But as he passed Margaret's pew, he paused, his shadow falling over her. You got a name? He asked, his voice low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. She blinked, startled. Margaret. His eyes stayed on hers for a second longer than was necessary, a silent conversation passing between them that she didn't understand. Come by Hollow Creek in the morning. I run a ranch up there. He glanced down at the little girl nestled in his arms. We eat breakfast early. And just like that, he was gone, the church doors swinging shut behind him, leaving Margaret alone in a sea of hostile faces. Her heart was pounding, not with fear this time, but with something else. Something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Hope. But hope is a dangerous thing. It comes with questions that keep you awake at night. In the small borrowed room above the bakery, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the frost paint delicate ferns on the inside of the window pane. Her hands were raw and chapped from the cold, but her mind was on fire with confusion. Why? Why had that little girl called her pretty? What did children see that adults refused to? And why had the cowboy, a man whose name she didn't even know, invited her to his home? There was no judgment in his eyes, no smirk, no second glance that made her feel like a spectacle. Unless it was all just a joke, a different kind of cruelty. She'd seen it before. Men in Red Valley who smiled too kindly, who offered a hand just to see how far she would fall when they pulled it away. They'd make promises just to watch her heart crumble when they broke them. But the way he looked at her, it didn't feel cruel. It felt quiet, steady. The next morning, long before the sun had crested the jagged peaks, she stood at the edge of Hollow Creek Ranch. Her coat was buttoned to her chin, her bonnet pulled low. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and underneath it all, the smell of bacon frying. A dog barked once, a sharp announcement of her arrival. The barn door creaked open. He stepped out. He wasn't surprised to see her, not even a little. Thought you'd come, he said. His voice was the same, low and steady. I wasn't sure I should, she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. Still did, he said, and it wasn't a question. He nodded toward the cabin. You hungry? She hesitated for only a moment, then she nodded. The fire was already roaring in the hearth inside, chasing the shadows into the corners. The little girl was sitting at the table, her small feet swinging high above the floor. Her face lit up when she saw Margaret. Hi, she shouted, her voice full of pure, uncomplicated joy. You came! A small, fragile smile touched Margaret's lips, one she wasn't sure would last. I did. She's so cute, Daddy, the girl said again, as if it were a proven fact she was proudly presenting. The cowboy glanced at Margaret, and the corner of his mouth twitched. He wasn't used to compliments, she realized. She's got a good eye, he said simply, turning to the stove. That morning, Margaret washed the dishes while the little girl, Isa, colored on scraps of paper with a piece of charcoal. She swept the floor, her movements careful and deliberate. Her hands shook when she poured the man a cup of tea, and a little spilled over the side. I'm sorry, she blurted out, her face flushing with embarrassment. The cowboy, Weston, he'd told her his name was, just handed her a rag. We got plenty of towel, he said, his eyes meeting hers. Only one of you. Something about the way he said it made her throat tighten. He didn't offer her a job. He didn't say she could stay. He just moved around her, a quiet, solid presence, as if she were already part of the landscape. as if she already belonged. That night, lying on a small cot near the hearth, she listened to the wind howl outside, shaking the window panes in their frames. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She didn't know yet that her past was a hungry wolf, and it was already sniffing at the trail she'd left behind. She didn't know that the only person who would stand between her and the shame that had chased her from Red Valley was this quiet cowboy whose daughter thought she was beautiful. She didn't know that storms weren't always made of snow, and that some hearts didn't break with a crash, but cracked silently in the dark. Weston showed her to a small guest room off the main living space. It was sparse but clean, with a simple bed frame and a wash basin. "It's not much," he said, standing in the doorway, seeming to fill it completely. "It's more than I've had in a long time," she said truthfully. After he left, she began to unpack her small trunk, the scent of lavender and old memories clinging to her few belongings. As she knelt to push the empty trunk under the bed, her fingers brushed against something small and hard. She pulled it out. It was a small bird, carved from a piece of light-colored wood, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. It was beautifully done, but covered in a fine layer of dust, as if it had been forgotten for a very long time. She was admiring the delicate details when Issa padded into the room. The little girl's eyes landed on the wooden bird in Margaret's hand, and all the color drained from her face. "That was Mama's," she whispered, her voice trembling. Just then, Weston appeared in the doorway behind his daughter. His gaze followed hers to the bird, and his face hardened into a mask of stone. The easy warmth that had settled in the cabin that morning vanished, replaced by an arctic chill. He strode forward, his steps heavy on the floorboards. He didn't say a word. He just gently took the wooden bird from Margaret's stunned fingers, his own hand closing around it tightly. He turned and left the room, leaving Margaret kneeling on the floor, the cold silence pressing in on her. The warmth was gone. The fragile sense of belonging had shattered. She had just crossed a line, a border she didn't even know existed, and now she was lost again. The rest of the day passed in a thick, uncomfortable silence. Weston was a ghost in his own home, his presence felt but never truly there. He worked outside, his movements sharp and angry as he split firewood, the axe falling with brutal efficiency. Margaret tried to make herself useful, scrubbing floors that were already clean, kneading dough for bread with a frantic energy. Issa was a little shadow, flitting from room to room, her usual bright chatter silence. Finally, Margaret couldn't stand it anymore. She found Weston by the corral, checking the latch on the gate. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice small against the vastness of the landscape. "I didn't know." He didn't turn around. He just kept testing the latch, his knuckles white. "Some things are best left alone," he said, his voice flat and cold. It wasn't an explanation. It was a dismissal. A wall slammed down between them, and Margaret had no idea how to climb it. She felt like an intruder again, a clumsy giant who had broken something precious and irreplaceable. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay on her cot, listening to the house settle around her. And then she heard it, a sound from the direction of the barn. It was a low, mournful noise, full of a pain so deep it made the air ache. It wasn't an animal. It was human. It was the sound of a heart breaking over and over again. Her own heart pounding, Margaret slipped out of her cot and pulled her shawl around her shoulders. The cold air was a shock to her system, but she had to know. She crept across the yard, the frozen ground crunching under her bare feet. The sound had stopped, but a faint light flickered from between the barn's wooden slats. She peered through a crack. Inside, a single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. Weston stood in the middle of the barn, his back to her. He was standing over a large object covered with a canvas sheet. He was talking, his voice a low, raw whisper. "I'm sorry, Alara. I couldn't protect you. I should have been there." He reached out a trembling hand and pulled back a corner of the sheet. Underneath was a cradle, a beautifully carved wooden cradle, smooth and perfect, but unfinished. One side was still rough, unsanded. He thought his wife had been pregnant when she died. The realization hit Margaret with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just grief. This was a wound that had never, ever healed. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked directly behind her. She wasn't alone. A good man shouldn't have to carry such burdens alone. The voice was smooth as oil, and it slid down Margaret's spine like a snake. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the Reverend Emmett. He stood there in the darkness, his thin face half hidden in shadow, a parody of concern etched into his features. How long had he been standing there? He's been like this since he lost her, the Reverend continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Prone to moods. He needs a proper wife, a delicate woman, someone to soothe his troubled soul. His eyes, small and black, raked over Margaret's frame, and the meaning was clear. Not astray. The word hung in the air, a deliberate insult. He was implying that Weston was fragile, unstable, and that she, with her own heavy past, was a danger to him, a burden. This town looks after its own, Miss Sullivan, he said, stepping a little closer. The feigned gentleness was gone, replaced by something hard and cold. You would do well to remember that. It wasn't advice, it was a threat. And Margaret knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this man wanted her gone. The very next day, a stranger rode into Snowvale. He was the kind of man who didn't belong in a place like this. His coat was tailored from fine wool, his boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his smile looked expensive. His name was Samuel Price, and he wasn't just passing through. He didn't ask for directions. He went straight to the general store and started asking questions. Not about the weather or the price of feed. He asked about her, and then he asked about Weston Dyer. Margaret saw him first as she was leaving the bakery. He was leaning against a post, watching her, that polished smile fixed on his face. Well, well, he said, his voice smooth and confident, if it isn't the belle of the scandal. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her spine went rigid. It was him, the man from Red Valley, the man who had ruined her. I didn't expect to find you this far out in the wilderness, he said, pushing himself off the post and stepping closer. The scent of his cologne, a smell she associated with lies and humiliation, filled the air. But then I heard whispers, a tragic, big girl with a mysterious past. Figured it might be you. I have nothing to say to you, Samuel, she said, her voice tight with a rage she had long suppressed. Oh, but I have something to offer you, he said, his smile never faltering. She started to walk away, to just get away from him, but he fell into step beside her. I could fix it, you know, he said, his tone dropping, becoming intimate, persuasive. Clear your name. One letter from me to the right people, a few polite conversations. Suddenly, you're not the town laughingstock anymore. You're the poor, misunderstood victim. She stopped and turned to face him, her hands trembling at her sides. And what would that cost me? His smile sharpened, showing a flash of teeth. Just dinner, a little time. We could pick up where we left off. The slap cracked across his cheek like a rifle shot. The sound echoed in the quiet street. You lied, she hissed, the words tasting like poison. You ruined me. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his cheek, his smile finally gone, replaced by a look of pure malice. You'll regret that, Margaret. I already did, she shot back. For years. She turned her back on him and walked away, her head held high, leaving him standing there in the mud. But Samuel Price was not a man who accepted defeat. That night, the whispers returned to Snowvale. But they were new whispers, sharper than before, dipped in a fresh venom. She wasn't just a jilted woman anymore. She was a seductress, a homewrecker. She was run out of Red Valley for seducing a married man. She tricked him into thinking she was pure. The lies spread like a disease, from the bakery to the church, infecting every conversation. Margaret felt it in the way people now looked through her as if she were made of smoke. The next day, she couldn't bring herself to leave the cabin. The weight of the shame was a physical thing, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She was staring out the window, watching the gray sky, when Issa crawled into her lap, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. On it was a drawing, a stick figure with wild, scribbled hair and a huge smile. It was her. It's you, the girl beamed. Pretty lady. Margaret's chest burned, not from the hurt of the town's rejection, but from the effort of holding back tears in the face of such simple, powerful kindness. Later, as she was bringing in firewood, she found Weston near the barn, methodically fixing a loose fence post. He didn't look up as she approached. She opened her mouth to tell him everything, to warn him that her past had caught up to her, to say she would understand if he wanted her to leave. He deserved peace, not her storm. But before she could get a single word out, he spoke, his voice low. They're whispering again. I know, she said quietly, her eyes on the ground. He didn't stop working. The hammer rose and fell in a steady rhythmic beat. Do you think I care what they think? He asked, not looking at her. She blinked, surprised. I don't bring people into my house lightly, Margaret, he said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were clear and direct. But once they're in, they're mine to protect. She stared at him, at this quiet, complicated man, and felt something inside her, something that had been frozen solid for years, cracked just a little. But Samuel Price wasn't just a man of whispers, he was a man of action. And he wasn't just after Margaret, he was after Weston. He had followed him here for a reason, and Margaret had just stumbled into the middle of a war she didn't understand. A few days later, things on the ranch started to go wrong. Not big things, small things. A section of fence cut clean through overnight, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off into the hills. Weston spent a full day riding the rough country, rounding them up, his face grim and exhausted by the time he returned. He blamed it on wolves, but Margaret had seen the fence. The wire was cut cleanly, snipped with pliers. No wolf had done that. This was sabotage. A few days after that, the water from the well started to taste strange, brackish and oily. Weston had to haul water from the creek for the stock in the house, another back-breaking task. He didn't say anything, but Margaret saw the worry etched around his eyes. She knew, with a cold certainty, that this was Samuel's doing. He wasn't trying to scare her away anymore. He was trying to break Weston, piece by piece. While mending the section of fence that had been cut, her fingers found something in the churned-up mud near the post. It was a cufflink, silver with a small black stone set in the middle. It was expensive, elegant. It wasn't something a rancher would wear. It was something Samuel Price would wear. She tucked it into her pocket, her heart hammering. This was proof. But proof of what? That a man from her past was harassing them? The sheriff in town was Reverend Emmett's brother-in-law. No one would help them. They were alone. That evening, Isa was drawing by the fire, her small face a study in concentration. Margaret noticed the little girl was using the charcoal with a frantic energy, her hand flying across the paper. When she was done, she held it up. Margaret's blood ran cold. It was a picture of the barn. But in the drawing, the barn was engulfed in huge, angry orange and red flames. And standing in front of the fire was a tall, thin man in a fancy coat, his face twisted into a smile. The bad man is coming, Isa whispered, her eyes wide and dark. He smells like smoke. Margaret took the drawing with a trembling hand and showed it to Weston. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. He didn't dismiss it as a child's fantasy. He looked from the drawing to Margaret, his eyes grim. Keep her close tonight, was all he said. But it was enough. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, made them jump. Later that night, long after Isa was asleep, the ranch dog, an old hound named Buster, started barking. It wasn't his usual bark. It was a frantic, terrified sound. Then the wind shifted and a new smell carried into the cabin. It wasn't wood smoke from the hearth. It was the acrid, hungry smell of hay and old timber burning. The smell of smoke was real. Weston burst out of the cabin first, Margaret right behind him. The night was lit by a hellish orange glow. Flames were already climbing the side of the barn, licking at the dry wooden roof. From inside, they could hear the terrified, high-pitched screams of the horses trapped within. They raced toward the inferno. Weston grabbed the heavy barn door, pulling with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. "It's barred!" he yelled over the roar of the fire. "He barred it from the outside!" It was a death trap. Samuel hadn't just set a fire, he was murdering their animals. Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through Margaret. She wasn't the scared woman from the stagecoach anymore. She looked around wildly and her eyes landed on a heavy fence post lying near the corral. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, the rough wood splintering her hands. With a guttural roar, she swung the post like a battering ram against the thick wooden bar holding the door shut. The wood groaned, cracked, and then shattered. The heavy doors flew open, and a wall of fire and superheated air exploded outwards, throwing them both back. Weston scrambled to his feet and looked at her, his face a mask of disbelief and awe. But there was no time. He plunged into the smoke-filled barn, Margaret right behind him, her shawl pulled over her mouth and nose. The heat was unbearable, the smoke a choking poison. They worked in tandem, unlatching stalls, slapping the rumps of the panicked horses, driving them out into the night. It was chaos, a nightmare of burning embers and screaming animals. Above them, a massive roof beam, engulfed in flames, gave a sickening crack. It was starting to give way, right above Weston. "Weston!" Margaret screamed. She didn't think. She just moved, launching her body into his, shoving him hard. He stumbled out of the way just as the massive, flaming beam crashed to the ground where he had been standing, sending a volcano of sparks into the air. A piece of the falling timber caught her shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain that made her cry out. But she stayed on her feet. They managed to get the last horse out, its coat singed and its eyes wild with terror, just as the entire roof collapsed inwards with a deafening roar. They stumbled back, breathing in ragged, smoke-filled gasps, their faces black with soot, and watched as their livelihood turned to ash. Weston turned to her, his eyes glowing in the firelight, filled with something she had never seen before. "You saved me," he breathed. Then his gaze shifted, looking past her shoulder, toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the property. For just a second, she saw him too, a silhouette watching the destruction, the man in the fancy coat, Samuel Price. He watched them for a moment longer, then melted back into the darkness. Back inside the cabin, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by pain and exhaustion. Weston gently cleaned and bandaged the burn on Margaret's shoulder. His touch was careful, tender. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the distant dying roar of the fire outside. Finally, Weston spoke. "He's not here for you," he said, his voice low and heavy with guilt. "He's here for me." And then the story came pouring out of him. His name wasn't Weston Dyer. It was Weston Drake. Back in Colorado, he hadn't been a rancher. He'd been a U.S. Marshal. And Samuel Price wasn't just some spurned suitor from Margaret's past. He ran a vast, ruthless smuggling ring, dealing in guns and gold. Weston had spent 2 years hunting him, getting closer and closer. "I was about to arrest him," Weston said, his voice thick with old pain. "I had him cornered, but he was always one step ahead. To get leverage to make me back off, he went after my wife." He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing a different one from years ago. "There was a fire at our home. They said it was an accident, a lantern knocked over. But I knew. It was Price. Ilara had died in the fire. Weston, consumed by grief and blaming himself for not protecting her, had lost his nerve. He couldn't prove Price was behind it. The law he had served had failed him. So he quit the marshals, took Issa, and ran. He changed his name, buried his past, and tried to disappear in the vast Montana wilderness. But Samuel Price had a long memory and a singular obsession. It wasn't just about revenge. "Before she died," Weston said, his voice barely a whisper, "Ilara found something. Price's ledger book. It has everything in it. Names, dates, shipments. It's the one thing that can bring his whole empire down." He finally looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a desperate weariness. "I took it. It's the reason he's been hunting me for 3 years. It's hidden here, on this ranch, and he will burn everything to the ground to find it." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of it all. Margaret looked at this man, no longer just a quiet cowboy, but a haunted hero, a man running from a past that was just as brutal as her own. She thought of the whispers, the sabotage, the fire. It all made a terrible kind of sense. She finally understood. She wasn't a burden he had to protect. She was a soldier who had just wandered onto his battlefield. "Then we fight him," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Together." The look on his face shifted. The weariness was still there, but something else sparked in its place. Respect. The dynamic between them had changed forever. They weren't a rancher and a mail-order bride anymore. They were partners in a war. They spent the next day making a plan. They knew Samuel wouldn't stop. The fire was an escalation. He was getting desperate. That afternoon, Reverend Emmett rode up to the ranch, his face a perfect mask of concern over the terrible accident. "A tragedy," he said, shaking his head. "Perhaps this land is cursed, Weston. Perhaps it's time for you and the child to move on. Find a more peaceful place." Weston's eyes were cold as ice as he looked at the Reverend. "Get off my land, Emmett," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The Reverend's mask slipped for just a second, revealing a flash of anger before he smoothed it over. "I'm only thinking of your welfare, my son. I'm not your son, and you're not welcome here." The lines had been drawn. Later, Margaret saw Weston ride into town. He was gone for hours. When he returned, his face was set like granite. That night, hiding in the shadows of the porch, Margaret overheard him talking to the town sheriff. She only caught a fragment of the conversation, carried on the wind. "I can't risk her," Weston was saying, "or Isa. I've arranged for the morning stagecoach. It's the only way to get them somewhere safe until this is over." Margaret's heart shattered. It splintered into 1,000 tiny icy pieces. After everything, the fire, her promise to fight with him, he was still sending her away. He didn't see her as a partner. He saw her as a liability, a piece on the board that needed to be protected, to be moved out of the way. It was Red Valley all over again. A man deciding her fate for her, deciding she wasn't strong enough. The old shame, the familiar feeling of being too much and not enough, washed over her in a suffocating wave. She wouldn't let him. She wouldn't be sent away like a child. While he was in the barn checking on the surviving animals, she moved quickly. She packed her small satchel, her hands working with a numb efficiency. She took nothing that wasn't hers. This time when she ran, it would be on her own terms. She found a piece of paper and scribbled a short note. "I won't be a liability." She paused, her eyes falling on the hand-carved wooden comb Weston had left for her days before. A quiet kindness that now felt like a lie. She left it on the table, next to the note. A final, silent goodbye. As she slipped out the cabin door and into the biting wind, she didn't look back. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken promises of snow. A storm was coming. She didn't know that from an upstairs window, a small face was watching her go. Isa saw her leave. She saw her walk past the burned-out shell of the barn and disappear into the twilight. Her heart, which had just begun to feel safe, seized with a child's pure terror. She wasn't leaving. She couldn't be leaving. Isa scrambled from her bed, pulled on her too big coat over her nightdress, and ran. She ran out of the cabin, out into the brewing storm, following the fading footprints of the only mother she had ever really known. The storm hit without warning, a furious blizzard that turned the world into a swirling vortex of white. Margaret was miles from the ranch when the first flakes began to fall, and within minutes she was lost. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, stealing her breath and blinding her. Panic began to set in. This was a mistake, a stupid, prideful mistake. It was then, as she huddled behind a rock outcropping, that she saw them. Footprints. But they were impossibly small. Too small. Isa. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The child had followed her. "Isa!" She screamed into the wind, her voice torn away and swallowed by the storm. She plunged back into the blizzard, her own fear forgotten, replaced by a frantic, all-consuming terror for the little girl. Back at the ranch, Weston found the note. He read the 4 words, "I won't be a liability," in a string of curses left his lips. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Damn fool," he muttered, but his anger was aimed at himself. He'd driven her away. He raced to Isa's room to find her bed empty, the front door ajar, letting in a swirl of snow. A trail of small, rapidly disappearing footprints led away from the cabin. Pure, undiluted fear, colder than the blizzard itself, gripped him. He grabbed a lantern and his rifle and ran into the storm, roaring their names into the uncaring wind. He raised the alarm, and soon a small group of neighbors joined the search, their lanterns bobbing like lost stars in the whiteout. But Weston didn't wait. He was a man possessed, driven by the terrifying knowledge that he was about to lose everything he had ever loved, all over again. Margaret was crying now, tears freezing on her cheeks. The lantern she'd grabbed from the porch flickered, its light feeble against the suffocating darkness. "Issa!" she screamed again, her voice raw. Her knees finally gave out and she stumbled, sliding down a small snow-covered slope. And then she saw it, a small, dark shape, curled beneath a snow-laden pine tree. Too still. She dropped the lantern and scrambled forward on her hands and knees. "Issa!" she cried, her voice cracking. The girl was lying in a small ball, a fine layer of frost already clinging to her eyelashes. She was alive, but barely. Margaret scooped her up, pulling the small, cold body against her own, trying to shield her from the wind. "It's all right. I've got you. I've got you, my darling," she whispered, rocking her back and forth. Issa stirred, whimpering. "I thought you left forever," she hiccuped, her teeth chattering. "I thought I should," Margaret whispered, her own heart cracking in two. "Don't," Issa sobbed, clutching at her coat. "You make my daddy smile again." Just then, a new shape emerged from the swirling snow, a figure on horseback, tall and dark against the white. It wasn't Weston. It was Samuel Price. "Well, this is a touching reunion," he sneered, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. He dismounted, and in his gloved hand, he held a small leather-bound book, the ledger. "Looking for this? Your friend the Reverend is quite helpful when properly motivated. He remembered seeing your late wife bury a memory box out by the old creek." He held up the ledger with one hand, and with the other he drew a pistol. Its dark metal glinted in the faint light. "The girl in the book. I believe I'll be taking both. You and the marshal will make a tragic story. A desperate father and his would-be bride, lost in the blizzard while searching for his daughter. So sad." He took a step closer. Margaret didn't hesitate. She placed Isa behind her and stood up, her large frame creating a human shield. "You'll have to go through me," she said, her voice shaking but full of resolve. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My dear Margaret, that can be arranged." He raised the pistol, the dark bore aimed directly at her heart. A shot suddenly rang out, sharp and deafening, from the trees to their right. It wasn't Samuel's gun. He grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and staggered back, clutching his shoulder where a dark stain was already spreading across his fine coat. Weston emerged from the trees, his rifle raised, his face a terrible mask of cold fury. Samuel, snarling like a cornered animal, dove for the cover of a thicket of pines, firing his pistol wildly into the storm. The blizzard became a battlefield. Weston used the trees for cover, his movements swift and sure, a hunter stalking his prey. Samuel, wounded and desperate, was a rabid wolf, firing at sounds, at shadows, at anything that moved. Margaret huddled over Issa, trying to shield the small girl with her body, her eyes scanning the terrifying whiteout. She heard a struggle, grunts of pain, the sickening thud of a fist hitting flesh. And then silence. An awful, ringing silence, broken only by the shriek of the wind. Who was hit? Who was down? For a heart-stopping moment, nothing moved. Then a figure stumbled out from behind the trees, silhouetted against the swirling snow, and collapsed face first onto the ground. It was Samuel. Weston followed a moment later, his rifle still steady in his hands. He was battered and bruised, a cut bleeding freely on his forehead, but he was standing. Just as he reached Samuel's prone form, more lights appeared through the storm, the sheriff and a posse of ranchers drawn by the gunshots. It was over. They hauled a cursing, bleeding Samuel Price to his feet and bound his hands. The ledger, which had fallen in the snow, was recovered. The truth, buried for 3 long years, had finally come to light. The Reverend Emmett, implicated by a desperate Samuel, would be arrested by morning. The town's rotten core had been exposed and cut out. Weston didn't even glance at them. He ran to Margaret and Issa, falling to his knees in the snow and wrapping his arms around both of them, holding them so tightly Margaret could barely breathe. "I wasn't sending you away," he said, his voice thick and raw, his face buried in her hair. "I was trying to be the hero, to protect you, and I almost lost you both because of my own damn pride. I'm a fool, Margaret." "No," she whispered, her hands finding his face, her fingers tracing the bloody cut on his forehead. "You're a man who loves his family." He pulled back, his storm gray eyes searching hers. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, simple silver ring. It was worn, clearly old, but it shone in the lantern light. "I told Emmett I didn't need another wife," he said, his voice shaking. "And it was the truth. Because what I need, what I want, is you, Margaret. Not as a wife to be protected, but as my partner, my equal. The woman who stood in the fire and didn't burn." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me? Not because I need you to fill a space, but because I choose you." Behind them, the men of the posse stood silently, their lanterns held aloft, their faces filled with a newfound respect. They had heard the whispers, and now they had seen the truth. They had witnessed her courage. Issa, bundled in Weston's arms, looked up at Margaret, her damp lashes fluttering. "Say yes," she whispered, her small voice full of hope. And there in the heart of the storm, surrounded by the wreckage of their past, Margaret nodded. Through the tears, through the years of shame and silence, she said yes. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. In that quiet clearing, under the bruised and healing sky, something profound had shifted. The woman they had laughed off the stagecoach had become something else entirely. Not because she had proven them wrong, but because one good man and one little girl had seen her right from the very start. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, not in the cold, judgmental church, but under the sprawling branches of a giant cottonwood tree on the edge of the pasture. There were no golden candelabras or polished pews. There were handmade wooden benches, wildflowers stuffed into mason jars, and a sky so wide and blue it felt like a promise. Margaret stood in a simple cream-colored dress, one she had stitched herself during the quiet evenings when her past no longer had permission to haunt her. Her hair was tied back loosely, the hand-carved wooden comb tucked neatly behind one ear. She looked radiant, not in spite of her size, but because of it. She looked strong. She looked whole. Issa stood beside her, the proudest little flower girl in all of Montana, clutching a bouquet of wild daisies in both hands, her smile so wide it threatened to split the sky. Weston didn't look nervous. He looked like a man who had finally come home. When he said his vows, his voice wasn't loud, but it landed with the weight of a promise forged in fire and sealed in ice. "I do." After the ceremony, no one hurried to leave. The whole town of Snowvale stayed. They passed around slices of apple pie and mugs of warm cider. Children ran wild through the pasture, their laughter echoing off the newly framed walls of the rebuilt barn. And not once, not in the entire sun-drenched afternoon, did a single person whisper about Margaret Dyer. Respect, she had learned, wasn't something you could ask for. It had to be earned. And sometimes it began with nothing more than one man standing up and saying, "That's enough." As spring softened the land, melting the last of the snow into the thirsty earth, Margaret stepped outside one morning, barefoot, stretching her arms into the pale sun. She saw Weston near the barn, a hammer in his hand, a half-built cedar frame rising beside him. She blinked. "What's that?" He grinned, a real, easy grin that reached his eyes. "A room." "A room? Faces east," he nodded, pointing with the hammer. "For the morning sun. It's for you." "Why?" she asked, her voice thick. He stopped his work and walked over to her, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. "Because you came here and made this place more than just land and fences. You made it a home. I thought the heart of the home ought to have a space that belongs to her." Her throat was too tight to answer. By the time summer arrived, the room was finished. Books ordered all the way from Boston lined the shelves. A simple desk sat beneath the wide window that looked out over the valley. And every afternoon, a small group of children from the neighboring farms gathered on the porch, their fingers stained with ink, their eyes wide with wonder, learning their letters from the woman their parents had once whispered about. Issa always sat closest, her tongue stuck out between her teeth in concentration as she copied every letter as if it were a form of magic. Sometimes Weston would stand in the doorway of his home, his arms crossed over his chest, just watching her. He wouldn't say a word, but the look on his face said more than he ever could. One evening, long after the children had gone home, Margaret sat alone in her room. The sun was dipping below the mountains, spilling liquid gold across the floorboards. She picked up the wooden comb from her desk, running her thumb over the smooth carved heart. She thought back to the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach, so full of shame she felt she might suffocate on it. That woman thought her story was over, that it had ended in silence and snow. But it hadn't ended. It had just begun. Outside, Issa was chasing fireflies through the tall grass, her laughter like tiny bells. "Come in before it gets too dark, sweetheart," Weston called gently after her. And in the quiet hush that followed, Margaret whispered to no one but the wind and the fading light, "I thought I had to be beautiful to be loved, but being loved is what made me beautiful." In a world that had once seen only her flaws, Margaret Sullivan Dyer became the woman who taught an entire town how to see again. She taught them how to honor strength, how to believe in redemption, and how to call something beautiful, not because the world agrees, but because your heart knows it's true. And in Weston, she didn't find a savior to rescue her. She found a partner who had also been broken and had chosen to build something new from the pieces. Their story is a reminder that love doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it's just a quiet room facing east, a comb left on a table, and a little girl's drawing with one simple word that changes everything. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, even the ones the world tries to forget, then tap that subscribe button and follow us at Westtail Stories, where second chances ride on horseback and love always, always finds a way home.